like to quickly introduce Badi, who's our CPO and co-founder of VALR. He's going to moderate the panel of experts you have here today, and I'll briefly hand over to him. But thanks everyone for joining, and thanks very much to the team behind the scenes who's put this all together to get in, and Wes from CV Labs. So thanks for that. And sure, Badi, over to you.
Thanks, Blake. Welcome everybody. For those who are in South Africa, thank you for taking the time from your evening to join us on this panel. And for the panelists and joining from all over the world, I'll introduce them pretty soon. So today's topic is unlocking crypto adoption in Africa, the frontline experiences. So why Africa? In the past 5 to 10 years, Africa is seen as the last frontier in the global economy. This is being validated by the amount of money flowing into the continent to catch this wave. Based on some of the stats, in the last 20 years, $20 billion have been poured into the African continent, businesses operating on the continent. But $8 billion of those $20 billion has been invested just in the last 2 years. $3 billion into crypto, into startup businesses in 2021, and $5 billion in 2022. And based on the recent report that came out, 10% last year, 10% of the investments were into the blockchain and crypto space. But the big question is, how does Africa realize its great economic potential? On the one hand, we see many problems on the continent, such as runaway inflation, unstable governments, war, famine, lack of infrastructure, corruption, lack of economic support for businesses across the continent. On the other hand, we are witnessing, incredible grit, resilience, an amazing generation of talented young people among the people of Africa who stand ready to solve some real problems and affecting real changes in people's lives. One of the key indicators in the right direction is obviously the proliferation of technology, usage and adoption of new technology like blockchain to solve problems. So in this context, today we are going to explore what is happening in the Web3 crypto blockchain space in Africa, why Africa needs this tech, where are we at in the adoption journey, and what needs to happen to leapfrog Africa's involvement in this incredible space. So to discuss this and more, we've put together a panel of amazing individuals. First of all, we have Yoseph and Yele. He's originally from Ethiopia, now a resident of New Zealand, currently joining us from South Korea, a complete digital nomad, an investor in African startups, an entrepreneur himself, and overall a really awesome person. I got to meet him recently in Zambia. Next up, we have Ayele Bademosi joining us from UK, originally from Nigeria. He's the co-founder and CEO of Nestcoin, an on-chain P2P crypto exchange, serial entrepreneur himself, and is working on some awesome things that he has recently shared on his socials. I met Yele as well in Zambia when he was there with Vitalik Buterin, when we were talking to some of the government officials about crypto and blockchain projects there. And last but not the least, we have my colleague, my co-founder and CEO of VALR.com, Farzam Ehsani. I've had the privilege of working with Farzam for over 6 years. And in that time, we've been partners for the past 5 years. Incredible human being, insightful thought leader in this crypto space. Great to have you all. Welcome. Yoseph, we'll start with you. You recently traveled with Vitalik Buterin across the continent. Vitalik is the creator of Ethereum to many African countries. Why? What was the purpose behind this journey? Where did you all go? What did you find out?
Sure. So in February, I led a trip with a number of Ethereum community members to understand and connect with grassroots communities and builders across African countries. The reason why this trip happened in the first place is just a recognition that global centers of gravity that are building the core crypto infrastructures and decentralized infrastructures don't fully understand African markets, African context and needs. I gave a talk at DEF CON last year, basically pouring out my thesis for why Web3 makes sense in Africa. And my narrative there was actually the crypto world needs Africa to reach its full potential and reach mass adoption for real world use cases. I believe there's an actual existential risk within the crypto industry of it ultimately remaining as just a small industry that reaches only 10-15% of different markets. And it's struggling to reach mass adoption and add real value to the world. And I believe Africa is a big part of it. And I think that message resonated a lot within the Ethereum community. And Vitalik was like, hey, I'd love to connect and learn more. He'd already been to South Africa and Kenya before. So he made a whole month available to connect and come to the continent. The whole notion of the trip was to learn, listen, connect, build relationships. It wasn't a set of splash events and promotion. We weren't trying to sell anyone anything. It wasn't representing any organization. But it was a really good trip. We went from Ethiopia, Zambia, Kenya, and Ghana, and met a lot of founders, builders, students, government folks, a lot of roundtables, and a lot of really engaging conversations, which is where I met a number of you there. Each person who participated probably has different set of takeaways and outcomes, so I cannot speak on behalf of everyone there, but I guess some of the things that jumped out for me is that crypto is not a theoretical concept in Africa. It is real, it is practical, it is meeting real needs today, but we're still scratching the surface of that. So when we look at things like stablecoins, they've had a good product market fit, especially with the Forex crunch, just the ridiculous predatory fees that the banks and different types of financial institutions have for cross-border payments, for all types of remote work, and was quite surprised to see a large number of founders working on addressing trust. Ultimately, what crypto is solving for is trust, right? And so people leveraging blockchain technologies to establish trust. I mean, there are a whole lot of other patterns that we picked up. Another takeaway for me is that, hope Yele speaks on this, but I think the point of decentralization is hitting home after a lot of the events and activities last year, when we see big centralized institutions falling on their face. It's not to say that centralized institutions don't have any role to play, but there's a trade-offs with all these different games. And I think the point of decentralization is hitting home, and I think many African users and builders are understanding the value of that, which has been really helpful. The last thing I'd say is, community is a core currency within crypto, and seeing grassroots community builders creating the right infrastructures for this industry to thrive, for builders, for developers, for artists to come coordinate, learn from each other, support each other. It's just like heartwarming to go to all those places and meet amazing grassroots communities who sometimes didn't even know each other existed in the same city. So it was a really beautiful experience to meet people doing the real groundwork.
Thanks, Yoseph. Just picking up on something that you mentioned about Africa needs this tech and it's not theoretical. Just wanted to throw a question to Farzam. VALR recently launched in Zambia, and it has also been closely following developments in many African regions, weighing up options as to whether it makes sense to launch a product where there isn't much regulatory clarity. Given the real challenges that we're facing, what is your take on the African crypto landscape? Why does Africa need access to crypto? And what needs to happen to make it possible?
Yeah, so thanks very much. And just a hello to our audience. Lovely to be here with everyone. You know, if you look at the currencies across the continent and you look at the currencies across the world right now, right? We are seeing a real crisis in the preservation of value in the units that people are spending their time trying to earn, right? Their time or their capital, right? And so, you know, Zimbabwe, as we know, has had difficulties since 2009. And oftentimes it's difficult to keep up with what's going on there. But take Zimbabwe, we had the introduction of the RTGS dollar in 2019, which is just called the Zimbabwean dollar again. And, you know, I think at last count, our inflation rate was something like $700, 700%, right? So that's not just, I'm taking the extreme case of Zimbabwe right now, but we also know that the West and the United States and Europe and everyone is experiencing a lot of challenges with the inflation and the devaluation of their currencies. So I think the imperative for the world to get some type of a currency that, to be frank, isn't manipulated and fabricated and kind of tampered with is critical, right? And particularly in Africa, you know, the demographics of the world are changing. Just recently, some of you may have read that the most populous country in the world is no longer China, but is actually India now. It's just been overtaken by India. And if you look at the demographics of Africa, the African population is growing and is set to really be a big economic powerhouse of the future. It sounds sometimes strange to say that in today's day and age where, you know, the West is the economic powerhouse and China has been an economic up-and-coming powerhouse over the last few decades. But if you kind of take a step back and look at the timelines over not just years, but decades, things are changing. And so that, coupled with the fact that our current financial system in Africa does a great disservice to the people in this continent, which is the fact that when they're trying to send value, right, across borders, they're being penalized with, you know, rates of 10, 15, 20% of the value that they're trying to send. And that's just unjust. It's unnecessary. It's not the future for sure, right? So there's a lot that we need to do in the crypto space, by the way, right? There's a lot of volatility in crypto, by the way, which I think is par for the course. If there weren't any volatility in crypto, then crypto wouldn't be what it claims to be, which is a completely independent asset class that the world has never seen and has never been associated with any other asset class. It's completely independent. And so we are in kind of that the birthing phase of this new asset class. And that in the future, I do expect to see volatility decrease. I think in the short to medium term, I think we'll still see a lot of volatility. So we can't just say, okay, Africa, get onto you know, cryptocurrencies, because there's a lot of stuff that we're working on and still improving. But I think something that we can all agree on is that we deserve better. As a continent, as a people in Africa, we deserve better. And I think I can speak for myself and all of us that work at VALR, and probably for the other participants on the call, Yele and Yoseph as well, that we're doing our best to really try to usher in a new financial system that will meet the needs of the people, not meet the needs of a few institutions or a few people at the top that are really benefiting from the current financial system. So there's a lot of work to be done. The need is there. The imperative is there. It will happen. It's a matter of time. It's a matter of building. And that's what we're trying to do.
Thanks, Farzam. Just a reminder for all of our participants, if you have any questions for the panel, please post it on the Q&A section, and we'll pick it up and put it to the panelists. So thanks, Farzam. I think one of the, as we understand the need for crypto technology in the African continent, the challenges are manifold, because not only are you faced with the challenges of the existing system, but also when you're trying to usher in a new system, there's all these obstacles and hurdles that are not very easy to navigate. You know, so the next question is for Yele. You know, Yele, you've operated in the crypto space for several years now, having founded Nestcoin and Bundle before, and you're based in Nigeria. What is your take on the challenges and opportunities that African startups and businesses are facing in general, and crypto businesses in particular? What are your experiences?
Thanks for having me, guys. And I think that's a really fantastic question. I think the biggest change in the last sort of, from 2017 till now, about like 6 years, is I'll probably say like a regulatory one. So in 2017, the overall market size was definitely a lot, smaller. I remember when I made the announcement that I was joining Binance as a director for Africa, the question then was, what is Binance, right? For those who were, not within the crypto industry, nobody had a clue what this company was and why I was choosing to join a company that was, based out of Asia. And now it's a very well-known name and things like that. And, we've gone from having a few players and sort of companies building the space to having a much more diverse and broader ecosystem. So we've seen sort of tremendous growth in just the overall awareness levels, even at the infrastructure layer as well. If you think about 2017, it was very difficult for people on the continent to use sort of on-chain products because of the fees. And now I think when you look at like the amount of L2 solutions or scaling solutions, or even L1s that are a lot cheaper, we're seeing kind of like more utility being built at the application layer. And so all the kind of broader indices of sort of the crypto space has grown positively. But the one thing that has, not gone in the right direction, in my opinion, is really the regulatory one, right? So if you track the number of countries that have come out to make some sort of statement about crypto or the digital currency space and the general kind of sort of leaning or sentiment, you will see that on an aggregate level it's trended more towards a negative one. And unfortunately, I think that is very similar to, I like to call it throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? And if we think about sort of this technology as a general purpose technology, it's like deciding to ban the internet because some people are buying and selling illicit drugs on the internet, not understanding that the same technology can be used to create companies like Amazon or VALR, or a lot of the innovation that we've seen over the last 20 to 30 years. And so I had to take a step back to kind of try to understand, where is this really coming from? And you realize that it's coming from a place of a lack of understanding. And I kind of take, a lot of responsibility around this, because when I got into the crypto space, I was very much focused on building the ecosystem. And what I meant by that was, how do we invest in entrepreneurs who are building the space? How do we get more developers, and how do we get more capital? And how do we get more global players taking Africa seriously? And if you look at those indices over the last 5-6 years, those have all trended up and to the right. But in terms of taking time to think about, where does this technology play and fit within existing policy, within sort of like the regulatory landscape, and how do we help regulators better understand, how this can play a role in not just economic development and prosperity and financial inclusion, and providing financial services that can really transform the continent. I think there's definitely that gap. And so that, I think I was reading something on Twitter, and people were comparing crypto to AI, right? And people were like, in a couple of months, AI has done ABC. And I had to go back to show people when sort of like AI in quotes was like birthed, right? Like the first mention of AI was like in the 50s, and AI has gone through numerous decades of winter periods and booms of lots of investments, even, mid 10, so like 2015, 2016, a lot of people working in AI stopped working on it. And yes, it's going through sort of like a, product market fit sort of moment at the time. But if you think about like when Bitcoin came into existence, it's less than 15 years ago. It's like 13 to 14 years. And so in a relative sense, like we're really, really still early. And if today, the regulators come out and all of a sudden start banning AI and saying that you can't use this technology and you can do ABC things, then the applications for the technology would get hampered, right? And so I do think that there is a huge opportunity for us to begin to look at the utility of blockchains and digital currencies, and begin to treat as opposed to thinking about crypto as this, unified kind of use case. How do we segment these use cases, and how do we then address those use cases based on what that particular sort of utility is, and that would go a very, very long way. So I personally think like one of the biggest barriers for adoption right now is regulatory. Obviously, I'm currently focused on building like on-chain financial services and things that, put power in the hands of the users directly. That is not necessarily focused on sort of centralized players. I personally learned the very hard way, right? And I think that was something that Yoseph talked about earlier. Now, I definitely know the challenges when it comes to centralized platforms. And as a business, we held assets with like FTX. And everybody knows what has happened to like FTX and how that has played out. I think one of the things that was interesting to me, and as I made this comparison, was comparing FTX and SVB, Silicon Valley Bank, right? Now, because Silicon Valley Bank was a regulated institution and was, in quote, that financial institution was backed by the government and sort of like was a regulated entity, even though they went bankrupt, they were able to sort of, provide capital back to businesses and customers and make them whole in a relatively short period of time. Now you then have, centralized institutions who have been proven to be bad actors, and unfortunately, people are kind of, sort of out of money, at least until things kind of like make those particular progress, right? And unfortunately, the truth is, the reason why we have centralized products in crypto is because self-custody and decentralized products today are really hard, right? And I kind of compare it to kind of electric cars. Everybody knew that electric cars were good for the environment, right? It's better to use an electric car than to use gasoline. But regardless of the incentives, regardless of kind of like the education and things like that, electric cars never took off, right? And so you had a company like Tesla who wasn't saying, oh, buy this car because it's an electric car, but was more about buy this car because this is the best car that you can get for the amount of money you're paying, right? And that resonated with people, and we've seen that adoption of sort of electric cars, over time. So when I think about the future of crypto on the continent and the role of decentralization and some of the things that would drive that adoption, I do think that, number one, we need to make decentralized or self-custody products as easy as possible. Number two, we have to focus on fundamental utility, right? So I really believe that we're going to see a lot of what I call on-chain financial services, which are essentially financial services that are typically provided by, sort of a bank or some kind of financial partner. And that same service is now being done on chain. and it's as easy and even better than, the status quo. And so when we begin to see all these elements sort of come together, given some of the positives that we're already seeing in the ecosystem, things like capital, things like sort of a growth in the developer economy, and just more awareness, from people across the continent, I think all of that coming together can really move the continent forward from an adoption perspective in a meaningful way.
Thanks, Yele. Thanks for bringing up the R word, regulations. So we have a couple of comments from the audience. One of them, Jermaine Reuters, says, my view is that mass adoption of crypto in general, not only in Africa, is the lack of awareness from Gen Z in crypto. Many, when asked, do not know about crypto. Don't you think the focus of development in Africa should be targeted at this demographic? Another one says, BRICS space is offering more friendly space for crypto's growth. So just want to spend a couple of more minutes, maybe get Farzam's thoughts on regulation in particular. Crypto for a few years have been operating mostly in unregulated environments, but we're now seeing many countries in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East starting to create frameworks and welcoming crypto applications to get registered and run licensed businesses. But what is happening in Africa? Why are we seeing no regulatory clarity here in Africa? Is this something that will unlock adoption in addition to some comments that we're seeing from viewers saying that education is also needed?
Thanks, Badi. Yeah, I think a lot of education is needed across the board with our regulators as well. There is a lot of stuff that's happening beneath the surface. So in South Africa, actually some of that is above the surface now, but we are expecting from June this year, a couple of months from now, to be able to start with the application process for licensing of crypto asset service providers in South Africa. In Mauritius, there's already application processes open. VALR is, in that process. Further afield, if we're going beyond the continent, we are still getting regulatory regimes that are trying to find their feet, right? So there was a question about the SEC and the US that's going on right now. And I can tell you that a lot of people feel very strongly that the US is going about this in the wrong way about how they're regulating the crypto industry, mostly by enforcement of the SEC and in their domain. And there's obviously some turf wars between CFTC and the SEC and kind of different players and regulators. So I think in coming back to Africa, there is a lot of education that's required, and there's a lot of kind of infrastructure that is also needed. And to be open with our customers and our community, we launched in Zambia in November of 2022. And just recently, we had to delist some of our Zambian kwacha pairs, and some of you would have received correspondence from us, but that's because our bank account was not functional, because there was apparently, and we're still trying to understand exactly why, but effectively, we are working with regulators and with banking partners around the world to ensure that a centralized platform like VALR is used for the benefit of the community. Any illicit actors or any kind of players that shouldn't be on these platforms, we work together with to stop. Whereas in Zambia, that understanding wasn't quite there. And so I think someone was scammed of a few dollars. I don't even know the exact number that was there. And because of that, we are not able to function in Zambia right now. Right. So we're talking to the authorities, we're talking to the banking partners, we're talking to a whole bunch of players in Zambia to say, listen, you don't understand the model right here. Can we help you understand? Because you seem not to have seen kind of how a crypto exchange works, whether it's VALR or anybody else. And for VALR, for Zambia to be able to welcome crypto exchanges or other players in this ecosystem, it's important for the regulators and the authorities to understand exactly how it works and the intricacies of what challenges there are where we work together to actually build a community, build an ecosystem, attract investment, etc. So I think all of that comes from a kind of a regulatory regime that's clear, and it comes from the education of the partners in the ecosystem, being the banks and others in an ecosystem. But I think there's a lot of work to be done there, right? And a lot of people in kind of, when I talk to people, they say, hey, why isn't Africa, why isn't VALR all across the continent? You know, we want to see VALR in every single country. And the fact of the matter is to launch in any country, period, is a lot of work. It's, you know, getting banking partners, integrating into the banks, working with fraud and compliance teams of banks, working with regulators, etc. And so we don't go where we're not welcome, right? I know some of our competitors sometimes play cat and mouse with regulators and banks, trying to open up a bank account, even though they're not allowed to open a bank account. Then they get caught, they close it, they open up another one. So our strategy is not to do that. We don't go anywhere where we're not welcome. And so with that requires patience. It requires engagement. It requires education. And so that's what we're trying to do across the continent, is to help with that education. You know, we've been running VALR for 5 years now, so we've had quite a bit of experience in kind of the highs and the lows of running a crypto business. And we're always very open and welcoming of any conversations that allow us to share our learnings with the spirit of progressing the ecosystem as a whole. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on the educational front, with the regulators, with the other ecosystem providers, and particularly, I might add, with vested interests, right? Let us not forget that there are many people that don't want crypto to succeed. There are many people that are happy with the way that the system is because they benefit from it. And so those players oftentimes are the most difficult to kind of work with, because we work with anybody. We don't see anybody as kind of enemies of ourselves. And I think this dialogue of saying we're the community against any other community is not the right dialogue. We are working for the benefit of the world, but there's a lot of resistance. But in my mind, it is a matter of time. The outcome has already been written, but it is a matter of when we will get there, how we will get there, and it will require a lot of work.
Thanks, Farzam. Yoseph, I see your hand is up. I also want to put this question from the audience to you, based on one of your comments, which is, given the rhetoric that mass crypto adoption is actually dependent on Africa, how do you think the next big crypto players in Africa will emerge? Because founders can't copy Web3 models from the US. They all have to be invented, drawn up from scratch. But as you answer that, I also want you to, from an investor point of view, given that you are also investing in African startups, given the uncertainty in the regulations, given the challenges that crypto businesses face in actually operating a successful business here, what kind of projects are you looking at? What kind of projects are you investing in?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, John, that asked there. Just before I jump to that, though, I just wanted to add something on the regulation aspect, which kind of ties in. So if you zoom out a little bit from even the 4 countries that we visited in February, so we met ministers, regulators, administrators. There were surprise press releases and stuff that happened during that time. And I picked 3 interesting patterns across regulators in Ethiopia, in Kenya, in Zambia, and in Ghana. One is that you talked about education, but I think there's a gap of really understanding the fundamentals of blockchain, decentralization, crypto. And some of those gaps are being filled with just headline press and media stuff that doesn't actually get to the core issues. And then you see all types of stories of so-and-so lost X amount of dollars doing this, or like your uncle's brother's neighbor lost some money and you're a regulator and those people are coming to you, knocking on doors. Weren't you doing something about this? So I think there's a gap there. And I think it's up to the builders and the communities within crypto to take on that extra layer of work of actually informing and educating regulators and decision makers of the basics of this technology and of the basics of the use cases. There are some types of people who can kind of extrapolate future use cases and approaches, you got to really show them in real practical terms. So I think there's like the basics of understanding, I think that's needed. Some governments are way ahead in actually doing research. I found Kenyan government leaders were very thoughtful, and the types of questions they asked were a lot more thoughtful and more researched and more nuanced than some other governments. The second bit is around talked about scams and all of that, and I think it's really like the types of projects that we build, right? And kind of comes back to your other question of investments and all of that. It is types of projects that are actually solving real use cases that are adding real value. Because if you look at it from the government's perspective, the things that they're concerned about, if you kind of build a pattern, one is economic and financial sovereignty. And it's a very serious question. I think we have to acknowledge it and we have to think about it. If US dollar stablecoins, be it USDC or USDT, is basically leading to dollarization of everything within Africa, that is taking a decent level of sovereignty out of those countries elsewhere, right? And so that is something those countries and governments are really thinking about. And I think if you're a thoughtful builder, you gotta find a way to engage at that level and really own the problem, because it's a shared problem, right? And we're meeting a bunch of founders who are trying to build different forms of stable coins for cross-border transactions within African countries. It doesn't make sense for, I don't know what like South Africa and Zambia are trading with, but if you're trading with US dollars and using SWIFT that's traveling all over the world and coming back to you, that doesn't really make sense ultimately, right? So what are long-term solutions for something like that? You got to kind of think creatively around that. And I guess lastly, around government side, with scams and some of those challenges, if you're building any crypto-based projects, you kind of have to also educate users. And I see a whole lot of projects that are trying to tokenize very fast, or trying to kind of take shortcuts. And the thesis, the question to John is, yes, African path is not the same. I love that, Badi, you said Africa is the last frontier market. I've got this Twitter post that's going to be launching very shortly. We've got to look at Africa as a frontier market. It's not a developing market. When we talk about development, there's like a predetermined destination of what the end goal is. And the unique context that Africa faces today is very different from what India faced, what China faced, what many other economies face, right? So we've got to look at it very differently. And that is basically, we're walking into uncharted territories. And so it's both exciting and challenging for founders and builders. The exciting part is that you're basically claiming part of an open source technology, making it your own. And there's, in my life history and the history books that I've read, there's never been such an opportunity where whole new paradigm technology infrastructure is available to you for you to use in your own ways, right? A lot of technology that's been brought to Africa elsewhere is basically build the X of Africa, where the end goal is that X ends up acquiring you, right? I think this industry is helping reshape what even success means, the types of products that you build. And it's exciting. I think African builders and communities should capture that. And yes, build parallels, yes, identify different methods of building companies, of building teams, of executing, of doing product development. But ultimately, I think the founders and the projects that are going to do really well in the African continent are those that are like intimately understanding the depth and basics of the technology. I think that's very critical. And also really building from first principle of what problems are we trying to solve. For example, on the trip, Vitalik was talking about, there's a lot of like DeFi, which is very complex DeFi, right? And sometimes it's a casino on top of a casino on top of a casino. And it doesn't really make sense because it's not actually solving real problems. If you look at African use cases, let's build very simple financial tools. borrowing, lending, escrows, insurance, like the key infrastructures that actually make a sophisticated financial institution operate and work. I think that's the bigger opportunity. And I hear you, Farzam, that there is a bunch of institutional friction, but African people cannot afford to wait 20 years for these institutions to get to the level of reach where they can meet the needs of 1.4 billion people. We're nowhere close to that, right? So, and I guess like we gotta figure out a much better win-win situation where governments see the value proposition, and local companies see the value proposition, instead of kind of scrambling to take a bigger market share of a small market. I think there's a huge unlock moment, and that the primitives of crypto is offering Africa right now.
Thanks you so much, Yosef. We are running out of time for this webinar. We did say it would end close to 7:45. So Yosef, we'll consider that. Well said. We'll consider that your closing remarks. So we'll just give a few more minutes for closing remarks from Yele and Farzam. Thank you so much for all of our participants' questions. I mean, there are some amazing questions. This won't be the last webinar that we'll be hosting. There will be many more to come. So we'll continue the discussion on how to unlock crypto adoption in Africa and make this space really vibrant as it deserves. So Yele, on this topic, what are your closing remarks?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I remain bullish. As Yusuf said, crypto needs Africa, and we are seeing a much more developed ecosystem, and the excitement, both in terms of like the builders, investors, existing players, even in the bear markets, is still quite palpable, right? So I remember 2018, and just that felt like a real crypto winter. I'm still seeing a lot of activity and things going on. So to me, I'm just like, okay, we go again, right? So for anybody who is just new in the space or has just spent, maybe this is like your first bear market, even if it seems and sounds like really depressing, I don't think you should sort of worry too much about that, and sort of spend more time connecting with folks who are building things, doing your own research, learning more, and just figuring out how you can contribute. I really believe that this is a truly transformative technology, and it will play a role in Africa's economic development. And it's technology for the people, by the people. Most times in the past, when we got technology, it was after the fact, right? Like, so decisions, like things have been made, right? We didn't really we weren't able to play around with it, mold it, shape it, build it. And this is the first time that we're really in the weeds, we're part of day one. And that for me is a generational opportunity. So yeah, excited to keep building, and hopefully we can pull crypto in the direction that benefits not just a few people or institutions or governments, but pulls a lot of us up together. Thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks, Yele. Farzam?
Yeah, thanks. It's been a great conversation. I think I was thinking about what I would like to end with, and I think I'm moved to kind of point out and really reflect on the fact that crypto is not the goal, right? Crypto is a tool, right? And what is the goal? The goal is we're trying to make the world a better place. We're trying to empower the people of Africa. We're trying to rid ourselves of a lot of oppression and injustice that has been going on the continent for a very long time. And so one can complain about that, or one can do something about that. And so I think my call to everybody that's listening here is to kind of really reflect on your own situation, where you are, whatever work you're doing, because all of us have a role in kind of shaping the discourse of humanity, right? Shaping the education of those around us and ourselves. And so really kind of my concluding comments would be to say, you know, that there is great hope for Africa. In fact, the future is fundamentally bright, right? But it requires work for us to get there. And so I'd really like to put out the call for everybody that's listening to think in your own lives, what can you do to progress things? You know, whether it's, you know, making your voice heard with regulators about what your thoughts are. You know, regulators have open lines of communication with the public that you can write to them and share your thoughts, whether it's building, or whether it's, you know, continuing with your own startup, whether it's educating your aunt or your father or your whatever it may be. But I think there's a lot to be done from a social action perspective, from a dialogue perspective. And so I'm very excited about you know, the fact that we've got a lot of people on this call, and that there are many conversations like this happening around the world all the time. And so really just a call to action for all of us to leave the webinar thinking about what can we do to help progress the fate of humanity. And if it so happens to be in crypto, that's one of the things that's brought us together here today, then what can you do to help people understand what's the truth about crypto, and to kind of dispel some of the myths that I think are holding back many people that don't know much about it, holding back some of the regulators, although some of the regulators, as Yoseph pointed out, are very well aware and are very educated on the topic. So just a call to action for us not to sit back, but to act, to talk, and let's work together to move the world forward. So thanks, Badi, and everyone for organizing this and having a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yoseph, for waking up really early and joining us on this webinar. Thanks, Yele. Thanks, Farzam. And thanks to all the participants. There were close to 150 participants on Zoom, and I'm sure there were other streams. People were listening in. Great conversation. So this will not be the last one. We will organize subsequent ones to explore more topics like that, like this one.